let me get started right in today with why actually I cared about being here today. Because I was off last week, and today's a crazy day because if you read me, you know I was up until almost 4 this morning, and we got the hearings tonight. And, anyway, the reason that I wanted to do this today is not only because I miss doing history, but also because the stuff today is really cool. So if you think about it, I left you with the American Revolutionary War, with the Revolutionary War, and with the idea that the revolution was a revolution in people's minds, which is how the framers or the founders defined it. But they fought a war, and they were fighting a war of independence. They were fighting for a war to, or fighting a war to get away from something. But the other half of independence is fighting to do something. I mean, we're fighting for freedom from something, but also freedom to do something. And I find the fact that the founders of what is going to become, not yet, the United States of America, are forced to try and create a government in the middle of a war absolutely fascinating. And of course, that's going to happen again during the Civil War. And that's where, my first book was all about that. And it's really interesting if you think about it. Like, how do you create at the same time that you destroy? And that strikes me as being an important concept in the moment we're in now, where in many ways we are destroying what has been in place in our country for at least, since the Reagan Revolution. But at the same time, it's imperative that we build at the same time. And so we're in this funny moment where we're complaining about how we don't have childcare, for example, or we don't have universal health care, or many of the things that other countries do. And then we're trying to sort of tear down the systems we have. But then at the same time, you're trying to replace them. So you have Biden, for example, is working really hard on the replacement angle of things. And it's not getting a lot of attention. But to me, that's sort of the really interesting place. Where are the cracks and the places you can wiggle to try and create? And what happens during the Revolutionary War is when the framers create, hi Ann, by the way, Robertson, one of my dear friends, his last name was Robertson, and he's passed, and I miss him. Anyway, during the war, they have to figure out what it means to have a government that is based in the self-evident truths that all men are created equal, that they are entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's an unalienable right. So that's inherent in them. And that they have the right to consent to their government. Like, those are great principles, but how do you put that in practice? And they're going to do that while they're fighting that war that I told you about, where their goal was simply not to lose, which means, it's a mess because everyone's like, are we going to lose? Are we not going to lose? So anyway, I wanted to get into that material today, which is, as I say, to my mind, really, really interesting and fun material. So during the war, the Revolutionary War, which is what I'll be talking about today, those colonies who were so bitterly divided, as I talked about in so many ways, have to figure out how to govern themselves. And they don't really have any idea. They've got principles, and they certainly have studied it. The people who are going to be trying to create new governments have studied governments. But, I've studied how cars work too, and I couldn't make a car work. So they're really going to be experimenting on how that's going to work. So the first thing they need to do is figure out how they can create a structure that both reflects regional differences, because there's a really big difference between Massachusetts and Georgia, and at the same time make everybody come together. And in many ways, we're still at that, right? And it's not, what's interesting about it for me in the present is that I don't think, you can think whatever you want, but I don't think all states or all federal is the right answer, because there are important regional differences in this giant country of ours, and they're part of what make us interesting. But at the same time, you don't want to focus on local things and state things so much that you lose the national organization. So where is that dance? And I think we're still doing that dance. So during the Revolutionary War, they're trying to figure out how to construct a national government. And I'll probably use the word national here, and I'll explain why later. A national government that is strong enough to raise money, because you always need to be able to raise money as a government, and to regulate trade at the same time that it doesn't privilege either the Southern cotton producers or tobacco producers in this period, or the merchant Marine in the North, in New England, for example. So how do you do that? I mean, this is obviously a big problem. Right? Do you want to be helping the large planters? Do you want to be helping people in the cities? Like, how are you going to do this? And again, I'm going to give you some of the solutions that they came up with, but aren't these really interesting questions? I mean, this is the kind of balancing act that a government of the people has to do all the time. And one of the things that I find very frustrating about the moment we're in now is the number of people who are like, I've got an ideology. That's it. That's what I'm going to do. And the reality is that ideologies are sometimes good guideposts, but maybe the rules that New Hampshire needs for their fishing industry are not the same ones that South Carolina needs. How do you figure that out when you're trying to work together? And I find that space in between needs for individual identity and needs for unity to be really the heart of American society in general. You've heard me talk about early literature and how that's really the central question, and Puritanism, and I guess maybe to me that's the whole question of the American government. Anyway, I'll shut up about that and get into what they actually did. So they are really, by the end of the war, they still haven't figured it out altogether. But what they have done during the war is to try and figure out how to construct any kind of a government. And what they do after 1776 is interesting because, for the most part, they begin to focus on the states. The thinkers about what a government should look like focus on the states. And so what does that mean? That means that if you're really smart, if you're a mover and a thinker in at that point, the revolutionary America, you're going to go back to your states. So Thomas Jefferson, for example, doesn't work on any kind of the national system that I'm going to talk about in just a minute. He goes back to Virginia and he begins to work on the Virginia Constitution, where they're trying to figure out what does it mean to have a government that rests on the consent of the people. This is a new idea. I mean, it's an old idea, but it's a new idea for that era. And how do you do it? So what they do is they begin to experiment at the state level. And they try and carry out their principles of consent of the governed at the state level. And they try and figure out how to make that work. So what they do is they create systems in which the people control the government pretty thoroughly. So they figure that if you're at the state level, you're going to be more, if you're a lawmaker at the state level, you're going to be more responsive to the people than if you're in some far off capital. Remember, we don't have a capital yet. The system I'm going to talk to you about is going to move around to different cities at first, but they're worried that if you have somebody who's distant, they're going to have lost their connection to the people, and they're going to start treating people rather as subjects than as citizens. And so they figure that the best idea is to put the center of governance at the state level. So what happens is at the state level, they begin to mix up their experiences as colonials with their ideas about what principles should be at the heart of a representative government. And many states actually keep that old bicameral legislature. They keep two house legislatures, and some of them keep the governor as well. But some, including Georgia and Pennsylvania, get rid of both their governor and their upper house with the idea that the people really should govern themselves, the people. All right. What they also do, though, is they believe that they need to switch the power of government because remember, and this is going to be really important when we get to the Constitution, in this particular era after 1776, what colonials are really concerned about is the tyranny of a central government. That's what they're really upset about. They've been upset about the king and the king's ministers, and central to their concern about the king and the king's ministers is the idea that that king and that royal government is taking too much power to itself, and it is taking away the rights of, at least before the Declaration of Independence, of English people. Englishmen is who they're concerned about, that they are losing their right to consent to their government, and that they are increasingly losing rights to determine their own fate. And that's, we don't talk as much about that as we used to. And it's really important if you read the things that they're writing at the time. You hear taxation without representation and you're like, oh yeah, they care about money. But they also care profoundly about the idea that they have a right to consent to their government. So when they're writing these early constitutions at the state level, they're very concerned about the growth of a strong government. So what do? They begin to try and curb the power of those executives or those people who had previously held more power than colonials thought they ought to have in the colonial government. So governors, for example, can't get rid of a legislature. They can't veto. They don't have the power to give land grants. They have very little patronage power, and patronage power means you get to put your own people into offices, which helps to protect your power. And what they do is they put the power of government into the hands of legislatures. Because the legislatures, if you think about it, had been the people who had stood up to the king and had stood up to the British government. So they think, well, we're just the best thing since sliced bread. We're the ones who should have the power. We're the ones who defended the people. So they tried to make sure that the assemblies of those people were really representative. So, for example, there were elections every year for many of them. You had to live in the district. Sometimes in some of the states, you as a voter could tell your representatives what they were supposed to do when something came before them in the eventual state legislature. You could say, well, I'm not going to back a tax on anything other than X. So they literally went there with instructions for how they were supposed to behave. No state allowed all men to vote. And of course, they weren't talking about women for sure. No state gave everybody the right to vote, but most of them reduced the property qualifications that were required to be able to vote. With the idea that you needed people to have some property in order to participate in society, because it was only the people who owned property who cared about the protection of property. So, for example, if you turned over voting, and this is going to be really important later on in the construction of the American government, if you turned over voting to a whole bunch of landless young men, of course they would show up at the legislature and say, hey, let's all get a piece of, Squire whoever's land. So they want to make sure you've got that you care about the property in your state. And I'm sorry, I'm stammering a bit here because this always makes me think about the fact when I was a young kid, 16ish, maybe 16. And we were down at the town docks, and I was there with a fisherman who was my age, and he was already had his own boat and everything. And somebody had taken a rock and knocked the light out over the dock. And he was mad. And he was, kind of a 16-year-old boy, right? And he's like, God, and he had profanity about it and said, someone knocked that light out. And I thought he was kidding. I thought he meant that he had done it. And I kind of laughed and said, yeah, right. And he got mad. He said, I need that light. I need that light to get out to my boat in the morning. And every time they knock that light out, it bothers me. It's a real problem for me. And I thought, he cares because he's got a stake in it. And that was kind of the first time I got this whole principle. Anyway, so they did try to protect property and to make sure that people with property voted. And that meant that most white men in those early years would be able to vote. They also tried to make the judiciary depend on the people. So the courts, the judges for the courts, for the most part in these early, and of course I'm talking about a whole bunch of different state legislatures, so they're all going to be a little bit different, but most of the judges were elected judges. And they were appointed by the popularly elected legislature. And the idea behind this was to let the majority do whatever it wanted. That the framers did not believe that people would vote to create tyranny over themselves. So it was safe to leave all the power in the hands of the people. They also insisted in all of the states on having a written constitution that amounted to being a contract. So we're all done, right? We're good. So we can all go home. Well, of course, this doesn't play out at all. And I could even hear you from here, all the people going, oh, wait a minute, we got ourselves a real problem here. Because sure, you give all the power to, say, the House of Representatives, which there isn't one yet, but you give it all to a popular vote. Lots of stuff that needs to get done doesn't get done. All right, so what happens is that while they're all working on the state governments, and again, They're literally like sitting in committees hashing this out. Well, what do you think about this? What do you think about this? And they come up with these state constitutions. At the same time, though, the national government languishes because the people who really are thinking these things through have gone back to their states to work on their state constitutions. So, with the Declaration of Independence, the Second Continental Congress I've told you about continues to do its thing. It continues to conduct business for the different states now. It maintains the army. It issues currency. It negotiates with foreign powers, but it has no charter to do that. It's just sort of going along the way it has been. So in July of 1776, the Second Continental Congress appoints a committee to draft a national constitution, which I just think would be so incredibly fun. I mean, aside from the Revolutionary War and all that, but what a cool thing to be able to write a new constitution. So they take their time doing it, and the Congress approved the first constitution in November of 1777. Most people don't even know that. They didn't even hear about that because it takes 4 years for the states to get around to ratifying that Constitution. And these, of course, are the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles of Confederation say something, I'm afraid I'm going to forget to tell you this, so I'm going to mention it right now because it's going to be very different next time we talk and I do the Constitution. The Articles of Confederation are a union of states. It says right in the opening, we're a union of states. Constitution doesn't say that. The Articles of Confederation puts the states front and center. And what it says is that there will be essentially a continuation of the Second Continental Congress. There will be a national legislature, and the national legislature can declare war, can make peace, can conduct diplomacy, can regulate affairs with Indigenous Americans, can appoint Army and Navy officers, can requisition men from the states to fight, can coin money, and can issue paper currency. So they can do all the sorts of I don't want to say paperwork, but you know what I mean, the things that need to be done at a national level. But crucially, the Congress, under the Articles of Confederation, can't levy taxes and cannot regulate trade. All right, now we got you just see the red flag everywhere right there with that already. What they could do was they could ask states, I'm laughing because you know where this is going to go. They could ask states to contribute to a fund when Congress asked them to. They also couldn't enforce any of the policies that they wanted to put in place. They could simply ask the states to implement those with the idea that everybody can agree on what's best for everyone, right? And all I can say in this, I'm tired, I was up real late last night, in this moment, climate change. Anyway, they believe that people will be reasonable within the states. So they essentially don't have any power to execute any of the laws that they may have, they may think should be put in place. They also gave the states continued control over the lands to the west because remember, many of the colonies had western lands or claims to western lands all the way to the Mississippi, some of them, and those land claims were overlapping. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. And the organization of the national government was also very weak. So the delegates to Congress would be appointed every year by the state legislatures. So they are beholden to the state legislatures, of course, where the real thinkers are. And no delegate could serve more than 3 out of every 6 years out of concern that they would garner too much power. And because of that, because of the attempt to keep them weak, people who were really strong thinkers and strong lawmakers didn't want to go to the national government. They wanted to stay in the states where things actually happened. So it tended to be characterized by fairly weak men. And as I say, they met in different places. They went to Philadelphia and to Princeton and to Annapolis and to New York City. And there was no distinct executive branch. The congressional committees made the laws and administered the laws and enforced the laws. And there was also no executive that could carry out any of the policies that the national government thought that there ought to be. So the national government, the reason you don't hear a lot about those early years of the Articles of Confederation is they don't do very much, and they're a really weak organization. But if you think about it, it's still an amazing thing that they managed during this time of war to come up with a system of cooperation. It's not going to succeed, but it's a really important moment there, because we tend to think, oh, Declaration of Independence and Constitution. There was actually a period of experimentation in between those two things when they tried a different system. And it was a different system that focused more on the states and more on the idea of almost direct democracy and how that was going to work without oversight by a federal government. So, again, it's astonishing in a time they do this during war. They do that when they're fighting the British government, this large navy and army, and they did manage at least to come together to think through how they could organize. So essentially, under the Articles of Confederation, the new Americans, there's not a United States yet, essentially set up 13 independent republics. And that the reason I'm saying I find this so interesting is that is where the current radical Republican Party wants to take us. They want to take us back to the idea that we have 50 independent republics for the most part, and they can do whatever they want within those republics, except over things that the Republican Party cares about, in which case then they want to use the national government. That is absolutely where the country was in the 1850s, and we're looking at the same thing again. And one of the things that people like me always point out is that we did this before. And in addition to all the social issues that we're grappling with now, we also know that it was an economic freaking disaster, which is one of the reasons that I was so beside myself over the West Virginia versus EPA decision, which is an attack on the ability of the government to regulate. Well, it's about greenhouse gases, but it applies to everything. If the national government can't regulate across states, we have ourselves a really big problem. And it's a really big problem that's going to look a lot like America did under the Articles of Confederation. Under those articles, this new country, which isn't a country yet, doesn't, it is a country, but it's not the one we're going to end up with. It almost doesn't survive. And that's really important that it doesn't survive, almost doesn't survive, because remember I talked about how after this other Treaty of Paris, like all the treaties of Paris, that essentially Britain just pulls back. It pulls to Canada, it pulls out to the west and says, we'll just wait for these crazy colonials to tear themselves apart and then we'll go back in. Meanwhile, Spain is sort of looking over at these colonies and going, we'll be there in a few minutes, because they can't agree on anything. They've set up this weird representative government, and here you have all these different kinds of people, and they really think that if they just stand back and let the country tear itself apart, they're going to be able to move in really easily. And again, this is something that historians like me see a lot of parallels with right now, with the use of disinformation amongst ourselves that is completely tearing us apart. And I don't write a lot about this, but who benefits when Americans are at each other's throats over things like birth control? Vote on birth control today in the House of Representatives. There's a vote on birth control, right? Like, really? Even 10 years ago, people would have been like, what are you talking about? Like, we are all agreed on this. The more we tear ourselves apart, the more it weakens us and makes us a better target for countries that don't wish us well. Anyway, so by the way, somebody asked why I use the term America. And because we're in North America, there's also South America, and it's really seems almost jingoistic to use what we are doing in the United States as America. I do that for a number of reasons, but honestly, the primary reason that I started doing that is because writers work on word counts. And US you can sometimes get away with, but United States, which you have to put in a book, is 2 words, and America is 1. And I'm always up against a word deadline. There's other things I could tell you about, but I am not intending to suggest that the United States of America stands for all these other places. And that's just a quirk of the fact that I am primarily a writer more than speaking. Anyway, so as soon as the British government, as I say, pulls back to Canada and pulls back to what is then the American West, the colonies start to bicker amongst themselves almost immediately, which honest to God, you could have seen coming when I was telling you about that, right? So they have no way to solve their disputes because the national government is not strong enough to mediate among them. It's not strong enough to say, oh, shut up, Connecticut, we're just going to do it the way Rhode Island wants. It doesn't have any of those abilities. So they begin to tear themselves apart really quickly. And the ways in which they do that matter in the long term for American history. So the first place that there's going to be tension in the new states is in the American West, what is then the American West, between the original states and the Mississippi River, the new boundary of this country. Because those western areas, first of all, are indigenous lands. They are there, and there are indigenous people living there and having, they have their own economies, they have their own social systems. They have worked quite well before that with the French, who are now, they've been overridden by the English, and there is, you can put on paper anything you want about those regions, but it's worth remembering that those regions belong to somebody else who is not keen on giving them up. So those lands right there are going to cause a problem first between the Euro-Americans and the African Americans and the indigenous Americans. But there is also the issue that that I talked about before, that people, Euro-Americans and African Americans who move to that region are poor for the most part. If you've got a lot of, duckies back home, you're not going to move out across the Appalachian Mountains. So they are hungry for land, and they are also really furious at the people back east who refuse to pay taxes so they can do things like have courts. So the frontier tends to be lawless simply because you sort of have to take justice into your own hands, or so people believe. And there is inordinate resentment against people back east. Meanwhile, the people in the east look at the people in the west and think, you guys are all a bunch of yahoos. You're out there, you're having babies, you're not getting married, you're drinking whenever you can, and people aren't getting married because there aren't ministers around either. And I could tell you about itinerant ministers, which is really interesting, but I won't do that today. In any case, there is going to be this eastern and western tension. And it happened from the very first moment that Euro-Americans set foot on the North American continent. But it's really going to develop in this period in pretty dramatic ways. So there is, after the Revolution, a massive movement across the Appalachians into that western part of the country. And this is why Daniel Boone becomes such a big deal. Because after the 1763 proclamation, I told you about the King's Proclamation that the colonials couldn't cross the Appalachian Mountains, Daniel Boone had already been doing so, and he didn't stop. So he begins to cross that boundary, and that's when he moves into what is then Western Virginia, but becomes the land of Kentucky. And the reason that we have Daniel Boone in our lexicon of mythology, if you will, is because after the Revolution, this guy a guy named John Filson publishes a pamphlet called The Present State of Kentucky, spelled with an E, not with a Y. And in that he says, this Western land is just so amazing that, basically the fish jump out of the waters into your nets, and the soil is so rich that you have to farm on it for a number of years before you can weaken the soil enough that it grows normal crops. And in that whole story in the book, the Present State of Kentucky, he actually has an appendix that talks about Daniel Boone. And Daniel Boone in that is presented in a really fascinating way as both sort of the nature's nobleman who lives with indigenous Americans and appreciates the land he's with, and is sort of this figure in the wilderness. At the same time, the whole point is that he's going to get rid of the wilderness and put towns in it. So he is both this primitive sort of nature's nobleman, like I say. At the same time, his arrival is going to destroy that nobility. And that is one of the reasons that people have found him such a fascinating character, is because he is such a shapeshifter, if you will. Not him literally, but the way he's described. Anyway, you can find that if you're interested. It's John Filson's The Present State of Kentucky. And the trick to it is the beginning of it is all about how rich the land is. And so every time I used to try and teach it, my students would be like, I cannot read anything more about chestnut trees. You can skip over all that and just go to the appendix, which is about Daniel Boone. And that becomes, you'll get why that's so important, because that's the first, really the first literary interpretation of what the American West is going to mean for this new country, because it's written almost immediately after the Revolutionary War. All right, so people start pouring out into the West. And by the way, Daniel Boone, I guess I have time to tell you this. Daniel Boone was related to the Lincoln family. And the Lincolns, this would be our Abraham Lincoln's grandfather, who was also named Abraham. He lived in Virginia on one of the routes from Kentucky, which was then the western part of Virginia, into Virginia. And legendarily, anyway, Daniel Boone stopped at Abraham Lincoln, the grandfather's house, to say, oh my God, everything's great in Kentucky. You should go to Kentucky. And shortly after that trip of Daniel Boone back to Virginia to find his wife, who by then was like, dude, I'm out of here. I'm going back to my father. That's a different story. He shortly after that, Abraham Lincoln, the grandfather, moves to Kentucky, which is how Abraham Lincoln, our Abraham Lincoln, gets to Kentucky. And I'll tell you more about that later on, because that story, of course, is going to become really important for the way that our Abraham Lincoln's ideology develops. So, but that is, there's this big move to be like, see what the West is like. And there's Daniel Boone. And Daniel Boone goes back to Virginia, and he says to people like that Abraham Lincoln, who was a very wealthy man, you should go to Kentucky. And so people do. In fact, there's a massive move across the Appalachians into that what now American, it's part of the Articles of Confederation, the new country's western land. So there are river towns in Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee very quickly. And by 1790, 2.25 million people live Euro-Americans and African Americans live in places that were uninhabited by Euro-Americans 30 years before. So more than 2 million people in this era have moved into that new boundary, across that new boundary. But listen to this. By 1800, one half of the people under the Articles of Confederation lived in towns across that Appalachian border. Half of the people lived in brand new settlements. Aside from the first arrival of Europeans on the North American continent, never since then have more people lived in newly unsettled communities. So obviously there is going to be enormous, I don't want to call it chaos, because I actually think those moments of settlement are really fertile times. I actually really like times when everything gets shaken up, because yeah, it's scary, and yeah, you don't know where the supermarket is. I'm kidding. You don't know what the supermarket is in those days either. But there's so much possibility, similar to this moment we're in now, right? So it's no one knows who's going to be the most powerful person in these new communities. No one knows what the churches are going to be. No one knows. And all that is very unsettling. It's also a time of extraordinary intellectual ferment and extraordinary change, which I'll tell you about more in a minute. The arrival of these Euro-Americans and Afro-Americans into that land is going to cause real trouble immediately with the foreign powers that are still there, because those people want access to the Mississippi River, and the Mississippi River is not part of the deal that they have cut with the Treaty of Paris of 1763. 18 after the Revolutionary War. That second Treaty of Paris I told you about. So what does this mean? And the English have not pulled back from their western forts. They are continuing to stay there and work with indigenous tribes. And the indigenous tribes aren't real keen on those new people coming over and taking their lands. And they also liked the French a lot. They were actually working happily with the French. So there's going to be a lot of conflict on that frontier. And crucially, there's also going to be the issue of, who are those people on the frontier? Are they states? Are they kind of the Western stepchildren of the East? Like, what are those people going to be? What does it mean in a government that is a popular government, um, to have all these people out there without, courts and new settlements, and who knows what's going to happen? So um, the way this plays out is, of course, the new Congress, under the Articles of Confederation, has no power to exert authority over that West. It has no power to push out the increasing encroachments of the British government, which hasn't pulled back, and it is trying desperately to figure out how to manage all that Western land. So one of the first things that happens is that the British try to encourage what is now the people in what is now Vermont to join them, to break off and join them. And I'm going to tell you more about that in a few weeks. And in order to make sure that doesn't happen, the Congress quickly has to take Vermont into the body of states under the Articles of Confederation, so it doesn't lose that territory to Canada. And so by 1791, Vermont is actually joining the original 13 states to be an equal part of the original 13. And that's going to establish the idea that people can come in, or states can come in to this union as equals and not as colonies, for example. And that's really important. For my comps, by the way, at least I felt I had to learn the date that every state came into the Union. And Vermont was great because it was the first and it was easy. I don't remember most of the rest of them now, but I remember going through the lists and what date each state came into the Union. Meanwhile, in the Southwest, Spain wants to break off as much of that new southern land from the new country that it can. So it closes the Mississippi River to traffic by these new Americans. And with the idea that they're going to break off all that region and say, hey, you come be part of Spain, you can have access to New Orleans, which is this amazing port. And in fact, the western part of Virginia, which is later going to be West Virginia, and Kentucky and Tennessee seriously considered breaking off and joining Spain and becoming part of the Spanish Empire down there so they could have access to the Mississippi River. So it's not clear that this whole project is going to continue, that the Western lands are going to actually continue to stay with the original 13. In the meantime, those Western states are, as I say, Western regions are really mad at the original states, which don't think they're providing courts. They don't think they're actually treating the people who live in those Western states as if they are equal to the people back east. There's fights over land charters, which state controls which Western lands. Some states have overlapping claims to Western land. And states like Maryland, which don't have any Western land, are, they're saying to the Congress, hey, take some of that land away from Virginia. Virginia shouldn't have all that land. And the states that don't have Western land are really worried that the states that do have Western land are going to be able to fund their governments by selling that land, and that's going to put them at an advantage over the states that don't have Western land that they can sell. And finally, when it comes time to ratify the Articles of Confederation, Maryland, which doesn't have land and it's pretty small, says it will not ratify the Articles of Confederation unless all the other states give up their Western lands. And finally, they all do in order to get Maryland to sign, because otherwise the articles wouldn't go into effect unless all the states signed. And so now you got yourself another problem. You've gotten rid of the overlapping claims in the West, but now you've got to do something about that Western land. They're also concerned back east about the people in that Western land because they're poor and they're not as well educated as the people back east. And again, the impression is that those people on the frontier are lawless and they're yahoos out there on the frontier. And again, someday if I do literature, I'll talk a lot about that. And people back east are concerned about the idea of sharing power with those people. And meanwhile, the people back in the West are furious at the people back east who say, we're not going to raise taxes to take care of the needs of the people in the West. So one of the things you will see coming out of this conflict between the East and the West, and I love this, is that state capitals move from the East into the West. or in between the two regions. So if you've ever wondered why our state capitals tend to be in somewhat funky places, and you think, why do we have a capital of, and I'm not going to pick on any particular state here, but remember, you've got the giant city in the state, and then the capital is, and I guess maybe I will pick here on Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and you're like, Philadelphia? But no, Harrisburg, because it's closer to the west. And it was sort of a way to say, we do value you. We're going to move our capitals closer to you. And that's why our capitals are always in such not always, but often in places that are sort of more in the middle of the state than they would have been if they had continued to circulate around the strong eastern cities. Anyway, um, the people back east who are thinking about the governance of these new Western territories begin to be concerned that people in the West will not look at things with a broad view, that they'll be only interested in getting stuff for their region. They don't know quite what they're going to do. And by the early 1780s, they are already starting to worry about the idea of the people ruling, that the people maybe is not such a great idea. So what they do is this. They have to figure out, and I love this. I'm sorry. Um, so when I first started doing politics, and even today, lots of people think about politics and they're like, "Oh God, it's so boring." It's not boring. It's figuring out how people can live together, and that's not obvious. If it were obvious, we'd get it right all the time. And the fact that it is not obvious strikes me as making it this incredibly exciting, fertile place for ideas and for social stuff and for economic stuff. It's where everything happens. And so anyway, I'm really interested in this. So what happens is this. What are you going to do about all those people out there in the West? Who knows, right? So Jefferson, first of all, proposes a way to incorporate them into this new union that is really focuses on the power of the people. And a lot of Easterners look at that and they're like, we're really concerned about those people. So what they do is they come up with the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And the Northwest Ordinance is brilliant in that what it does is it sets up the idea of Congress overseeing the, I gotta say, I'm hearing 1787 in my mind. I don't think that's right. But sometimes my brain skips and I don't have a date right. I thought it was 1795. My notes say 1787. Maybe somebody can look that up and put it in there. I put it in the chat. But what they say is they're going to set up a system in which Congress will establish some control over a region for an initial period. So Congress will appoint a governor, a secretary, and 3 judges over this new territory that wants to be admitted to join the others. When the population gets 5,000 adult males, free adult males, not enslaved adult males, the people can establish a legislature, but any of their laws is going to require the approval of the governor. And then they can have a representative in Congress who can talk but can't vote. That's going to be a delegate. And then when the population reaches 60,000 people, it can apply for statehood. I'm going to tell you more about that in just a minute, but that's a really big deal. Because what that says is that this new country is not going to have colonies. That's huge. They're not going to become an imperial power. Now, mind you, that's going to change in around the time of about 1900. And it's something that still bothers me that changed. But the fact that these guys said, we're not going to hold colonies, we're going to let people come in as equals to us, is such a big deal. And I feel like we don't recognize what a big deal that is. To say, yeah, we're going to share power. We're going to share power. We're going to give you out there in Illinois, although we're not talking about Illinois yet, we're going to give you the exact same power we have. That's really kind of amazing if you think about it. So what they do is they decide that a territory that is north and west of the Ohio River, so this is eventually going to be Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin, known as the Northwest or the Old Northwest, is going to be organized under this concept. They're also going to do something else as well. They're going to say in that Northwest Ordinance that there will be no, there's two things they do in that Northwest Ordinance. And I remember finding this. I was reading the Northwest Ordinance very late one night for a couple books ago, and I found it, and I was like, how did I not know this? And I actually wrote to a dear friend of mine who knows everything. And I said, is this right? Did I miss this? And he was like, holy crap, I never really noticed that either. One of the things they did in the Northwest Ordinance, one of the first things that first they say this is this is going to be a law that covers the region I just told you about. But then the second thing they do is they outlaw primogeniture. Primogeniture was a system of law that at the time existed in Virginia, and it came from England. And what it said was that if grandpa dies, the oldest son gets everything. Primogeniture, first person born gets all the property. Now that matters because primogeniture concentrates wealth. And that's exactly what's going to happen, by the way, to the Lincolns, is that when grandfather Abraham dies, he is killed by indigenous Americans. He's on their land, he's in the fields, and they kill him. All of his wealth goes to his oldest son, Mordecai. And Mordecai becomes like this really rich dude who has racehorses and all that. And the two younger sons, including Thomas Lincoln, never even learn how to read. They become day laborers because Mordecai got everything. So the Northwest Ordinance gets rid of primogeniture, and it gets rid of enslavement. It says these lands will not have human enslavement. And they say that, and this is, by the way, this is the same dudes who wrote the Constitution, and not the Constitution, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, and who themselves, many of whom themselves were enslavers, because they were afraid that enslavement also concentrated wealth, because they had the example of what was happening in places like Kentucky, where people like Uncle Mordecai were able to concentrate wealth through their use of primogeniture and through their use of enslaving other people. So the Northwest Ordinance is an enormously important law that we get from the Articles of Confederation that not only says, yeah, we mean it when we say we're going to share power, because they do, but that also says, and we're very concerned that we don't want rich people to take everything. And that is going to be crucially important in the way that people throughout the 19th century, and actually I could use you to argue all the way to today, think about America. The fact that they set up the Declaration of Independence, recognized that enslavement and that primogeniture were endangering the idea of everybody being equal under the law because it concentrated wealth, and they changed that. And that's why that's why the Northwest Ordinance is so enormously important. And I always say to my students, the only thing you need to remember from the Articles of Confederation is the Northwest Ordinance, and that's really, really, really important. All right, so the other thing, of course, they are doing here is they're not talking at all about the indigenous Americans who live there. And I'm going to tell you more about that when we get when I get away from the governmental stuff. But so at the same time, they're saying, yeah, we really mean that everybody should have a say. They're saying we mean that our people should have a say. And that's a really important distinction that I'll make a lot more of later on. So don't forget that those lands are indigenous lands that we're imposing this on. At the same time, the idea of everybody's great and we're all going to have a say in our government has been tempered already by the time of the Northwest Ordinance with the idea that, well, you can have a say once we've kind of trained you up to it. Once you've had a governor, once you've had a system in place, once you've learned to have a legislature, then you can join us, as opposed to, hey, yeah, all you guys out there, you can join us when you want to. So there's kind of a training wheels period for people to join the union. Now, I just want to give you a little bit of a heads up that while the Northwest Ordinance is astonishing, there's going to be a really important change in in the way that we handle territories after the Civil War. Because the territories that are going to come into the Union before the Civil War are going to come in bang, bang, bang. The second that Euro Americans and African Americans, and later on Asians and Mexicans in the case of California, when they come in, it's the they get a territorial government. Within a year or two, they become states because the territorial government goes in to essentially impose order when there's a huge rush into an area. But the center of the country, the plain states that are organized during the Civil War, are going to remain territories for more than a generation. And that's dramatically going to change their political systems. Even though people don't pay attention to that now, that's actually really going to matter. And I will tell you about it when we get there. All right. So everything's just great, right? Except it's not, because what I have not said anything about at all yet is the fact that in this country that has just fought a war because everybody has a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, actually has a 500,000 people who are enslaved. And that's, I've talked at huge length, I've written a whole book about how those two things go hand in hand. That's about 20% of the population in 1775. Nearly 90% of enslaved Africans and African Americans live in the South. And white Southerners are pretty defensive about the idea of enslavement in this ferment of liberty. But they also think that enslavement will die out. They just don't want to think about how that's going to happen. They don't think this is a permanent condition at this point. And in fact, after and during the Revolutionary War, a number of enslavers in the South do free their enslaved people because, first of all, because of the intellectual problem of owning other human beings at a time when you're saying that every human being has the right to liberty. But even more than that, in this period, places like Maryland and Virginia are switching from tobacco, which has completely depleted their soil, to wheat. And wheat is less labor intensive crop. So it makes sense to say, no, I don't really want to support a workforce any longer. And that's going to snowball throughout the early 19th century. And I'll tell you more about that in the future. They also make it easier to end enslavement, to free somebody's enslaved neighbors. But in fact, between 1776 and 1789, a number of southern states joined the North in prohibiting the importation of more enslaved human beings. And in the Upper South, there are a number of anti-slavery societies. I know some of your heads are exploding, but I'm going to tell you why all this is in a minute. No southern state abolished enslavement, and most planters continued to enslave their neighbors. And they defended it with the argument that they had a right to property, and the definition of enslaved people as property is going to matter a lot because the Constitution protects property. They also are concerned about the idea of having there be a large landless population in their region because they've had trouble with that in the past. If you remember, for example, Bacon's Rebellion, one of the things that creates the really hard hand of racial enslavement coming down the way it did. And I think I told you about that. And people like me have argued that the whole concept of freedom in America depended on the idea of unfreedom. But I'm not going to go into that here because I've done so many videos about that. Anyway, increasingly in the North, where enslavement is not really an imperative for the economy, northern states free, it's called manumitting. So if I say that word, that's all it means, but it's kind of the way we think about it when we talk about it. Free their enslaved people. But the southern states don't do that. So for African Americans themselves, the Revolutionary War actually does little to change their status. Some of them do, in fact, become free after fighting for the Americans in the Revolutionary War. And a number also escape from their bondage during that war. And I'll tell you more about that really when we talk about the Civil War. And increasingly, there are formerly enslaved communities in cities. I think I've told you about that as well. And there are increasingly they've been developing for a long time, but increasingly self-conscious African American cultural communities, especially in the cities and especially in northern cities. Still, though, there are more Black Americans enslaved in 1800 than there were in 1776, and they are now growing in the American South. They're growing really labor intensive and extraordinarily valuable crops like rice and cotton. And that I'm going to tell you about more in a little bit. All right, so not today, but hold in your heads that the Southern people who are enslaving their neighbors think it's going to end, but they don't really want to think about how. And there's going to be a major change in the economy that's going to throw that right out the window. But that moment of we're just going to kick it down the road is very real for a very brief period of time. All right, so the other thing that's interesting is that the Revolutionary War causes terrible economic trouble in the United States. So when the war breaks out, Americans lose their access to foreign markets. The British government cuts them off. They lose their credit, which they have been getting from British sources. And the Southern planters are the hardest hit by that as well. The North is hard hit as well. The cities are occupied, the Navy shuts down other cities, and after the war, both Britain and France closed their colonies to American trade. So the Americans are in real hard trouble selling things at the same time that the British and the French are selling their goods in America. And remember, I talked about mercantilism and the idea that it's good for a country to manufacture things and to sell it to somebody else, because what you really want in your treasury is dollars, or not, is money. And so the Americans are really getting hard hit by the concept of mercantilism in this period, which, by the way, of course, Adam Smith writes The Wealth of Nations in 1776. So all these ideas are spinning around at the time. People buy those products and they end up going deeply in debt. At the same time, the government is also in debt. It has financed the Revolutionary War with the production of about $700 million in paper money, but it can't pay it back. They've just produced the money, and it's not resting on anything except the promise that someday it's going to be paid back. So by 1781, American money was so worthless that the concept of something being not worth a continental, the money was known as continentals, not worth a continental, was the sign that something was worthless. To the point that when I was a little girl, and I'll be 60 this year, my mother who was born in 1922, if she was referring to something as being worthless, she would say, "Oh, that's not worth a continental." And it was rag paper money. It was useless money. And I'm making that big a deal about that now, because, oh boy, is that going to be important in 1861 when we start constructing a financial system in the country. So they can't pay it back, and that sets off enormous inflation, because if you're not sure it's worth something, you're going to ask more for it. And Congress can't do anything about it. It can't stop imports, because remember, it's not allowed to regulate trade. It's not able to get coin money, specie, from flowing out of the country, because it can't regulate that either. It can't stop states from issuing their own paper money. It doesn't have the power to do that. So that's going to create more inflation, and it's going to create runaway problems between wages and costs. And the economic system is largely a mess. And as that happens, people get more and more frustrated that Congress doesn't do anything. So the states start refusing to give Congress any more power than it already has to do anything. So they're more and more sort of hunkering down at their state level. The states are also hurting incredibly badly because of all these things I just talked about. And a lot of the people who have actually done well in the Revolutionary War, because they've been selling to support the troops, are now in real trouble because of inflation and because their businesses are falling off in the somewhat inevitable recession that comes after a war until World War II. And farmers and debtors are just crushed by inflation. So because they can't afford to buy anything. So debtors are protesting and angry. Small farmers are protesting and angry. They want the government to do something to relieve the economic troubles they're in. And by the 1780s, it is very clear that this new government is not going to be able to hold this new country together. So a group of Virginians asked Congress to get together and to create some uniform commercial regulations. And I'll tell you more about that. But imagine what it's like if New York City can make regulations that it takes business away from Boston. And in fact, one of the things that's going to encourage Maine to break off from Massachusetts is later on when tariff laws change and you no longer have to get a pass in and out of Boston Harbor. Maine's like, okay, we're happy to be a different state then because we don't have to be Massachusetts any longer to come in and use Boston Harbor. So this idea that we need a new government that's going to create uniform commercial rules so that nobody can undercut another state in order to get a better deal from England or from Spain is really important to a number of Virginians especially, but a number of other people as well. So they asked Congress to set up a meeting of the states to create a uniform set of commercial regulations. And that group is going to meet in September of 1786 when delegates of 5 states meet in Annapolis. But by the time they meet in Annapolis, they are already the drivers of this move are already talking about the fact they need a new government and they need a new, stronger government than the one they've got. And these people are going to be lawmakers like George Washington, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, people who believe that these new states needs some new kind of government to control their commercial their commercial rules with other countries, but also to control their finances and to control other things as well. So they are going to call for a second broader meeting in Philadelphia in 1787 to revise the Articles of Confederation, and Congress agrees. I'm going to leave you with that there. You know where we're going, and I will tell you more about how they got to feeling like they had to redo the government system that they had. But I wanted to really focus today on this experiment of giving all the power to the states and show you how quickly that fell apart. And that theme is going to resonate right through to, in fact, there's a moment in Eisenhower's administration when he says, wait a minute, you're just trying to bring back the Articles of Confederation. We've been there, we've done that, it doesn't work. So this moment, this Articles of Confederation moment, is actually going to be really important for the way that Americans who are going to be coming together under the Constitution next time we meet see the concept of Republican government, Republican representative government. All right, I'm going to go write a book. Thank you for being here, and I hope you're all going to be glued to your TV at 8 o'clock tonight. I expect to be live tweeting yet again. I will see how long this goes on tonight. I'll tell you, when I'm live tweeting and they go on for more than 2 hours, my hands get tired. Anyway, we'll see. Thank you for being here. And next up is going to be Shays' Rebellion and the Jay-Gardoki Treaty, and then the Constitution. So we'll do that next time we meet. Thanks for being here.